So I recently just saw Joker for the first time. The main reason why I saw it now as opposed to any other time is because it was on my list for quite a while, but the thing that really added it to the top was the fact that Joker 2 is in theaters right now, and obviously I want to see that, but before I see that I have to see this one. And I'm glad I did, because this was very enjoyable. First off, I really like how this movie built up the city and atmosphere that it takes place in. The movie was also pretty well shot for the most part. There's some really nice depth of field and also some lighting going on that really establishes this gritty effect. Joaquin Phoenix was absolutely amazing in this role, and he was the best actor in the entire movie, unsurprisingly. There are so much details and mannerisms that he's able to bring to this character and movie. This movie is also well written for the most part. There are plenty of scenes where it delves into this character as a character study, and it explores several aspects of his personality in very thoughtful and interesting ways. And there are certainly many great aspects and scenes to go along with this performance that are truly unnerving and unsettling. And that is a good thing, as this movie aims to be unsettling. There are also certain scenes and aspects to the story that I felt were lacking compared to the stronger aspects of it, such as the girlfriend subplot in this movie that I found kind of being unconvincing with its emotions that I was trying to convey. I really enjoyed how this character was written in this movie. It certainly leaves a lot to think about on a second watch, and I'm eager to watch this movie again. There are certainly a lot of details and mannerisms to pick up on this character, and a few more minor issues that I found myself being a little bit uninvested at some points in this movie, but that's not a huge complaint at all, and I'm definitely looking forward to watching this again. So this one gets a very solid 7 out of 10. I also got around to watching The Dead Don't Die. Now this is a pretty interesting movie to think about and discuss, and although I enjoyed it, I don't really recommend it to everyone. Now the reason why I watched this movie is because it was written and directed by Jim Jarmusch, who directed Patterson, which is one of my favorite movies ever. He certainly is a very interesting voice in cinema today, and I'm interested to watch his other movies. Now judging by the title and poster of this movie, you might expect this to be a Shaun of the Dead type movie, but if you're familiar with Jim Jarmusch's movies and tone and style, you would definitely know to expect something else. And this movie certainly is something else. This movie is very slow paced and not much happens in this movie at all, which in this case is actually a good thing. Now one thing I can say about this movie is that it definitely has its own sense of personality. Just like Patterson, all the characters and humor in this movie are very dry and awkward. I really enjoyed Bill Murray and Adam Driver's performances together and their whole dynamic. It certainly works for what the film is going for, and it's delivered very well. Some of the most memorable moments of the movie come from these two. Now the way that the movie builds up to the zombie apocalypse and outbreak could be described as derivative from other zombie movies, but what makes it work for what this film is going for is the fact that it feels very mundane and kind of slow paced during it. It really gives you enough time to soak up the situation and atmosphere of the movie and characters, not to mention when the zombie outbreak does happen, it leads to some great comedic moments throughout the film. Now this movie is very slow paced and it does feel like a slow burn. I was never really bored by it, and I was always interested to see what happens next, but I can totally understand when people say that they find this movie absolutely boring. Now I mentioned earlier Bill Murray and Adam Driver's performance together, and that does not just only apply to them. All the characters in this movie have a great dynamic with each other, and it's very dry and watchable throughout. Now another thing about this movie is that it feels more like an ensemble cast of characters rather than just one main character, and having a bunch of characters in this movie is a good choice in my opinion because it gives you a lot of different perspectives to follow, and they're all certainly memorable in my mind. Some of these plot lines intersect, some of them just go completely nowhere, and again, that's not a bad thing inherently for this type of movie. Now the humor and comedy writing of this movie is something you're going to have a specific taste for, but I think all the actors did a good job pulling off their performances. Another thing that I really want to mention about this movie real quick is that there are a lot of weird fourth wall breaks in this film. I don't want to get too into detail because they're really something that you should just experience for yourself, but I'm really debating whether or not that's a flaw or just another likable quirk to this movie. Maybe I'll feel more strongly about it on a second watch, but it's just something I thought I should mention. So overall, a very interesting movie to think about. If you're familiar with Jim Jarmusch's other works and enjoyed his style, then definitely check this one out because you'll probably enjoy it. Now if this is your first Jim Jarmusch movie, definitely watch Patterson before watching his others. If you like Patterson, check out his others. If you don't like Patterson, don't even bother. For me, I'm definitely going to rewatch this, and for right now, I'll give it a 6 out of 10. So I got around to watching Game Night. Now the main reason why I watched this movie was because it was directed by John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein, who also wrote Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, and I actually reviewed that movie in a separate video. Now long story short, I felt that movie had a lot of potential that left unfulfilled. but I'm happy to say that's not the case with Game Night. Now, I actually enjoyed this movie a little bit more than I thought I would. I didn't expect to hate this movie or anything, but based off D&D, I thought this movie would be another kind of missed potential. But I'm actually happy to say that this movie wasn't the case and it actually managed to be pretty fun. Now I can think of several aspects that this movie did a lot better than Dungeons & Dragons. First off, the comedy writing and overall comedic personality is a lot stronger than Dungeons & Dragons, and I credit that to this movie having a different writer than that movie. Now this movie definitely has its fair share of memorable comedic moments, but it does have its fair share of missed opportunity, just points where the humor really didn't quite stick. Now some of these are worse offenders than others, but overall I enjoyed the comedy of this film. Another strong aspect to this movie would be the camera work and cinematography, which was very well thought out. For instance, there are some really creatively filmed sequences where the objects are made to look like game pieces. It's a cool little detail to add it to the movie. There's also a one-take coordinated sequence throughout this movie which was very well thought out, and it had some great energy during that particular scene. Now when it comes to the cinematography and visual presentation, they did really not cheap out when it came to that aspect. There are several scenes where they film things in very creative, interesting ways that gives you extra appreciation for the thought put into it, and I really appreciate that level of forethought for this type of movie. Now all the performances are serviceable for this type of movie. Jason Bateman gave the exact same performance as he always gives. Jesse Plemons was absolutely great in this movie, and he had some really amazing comedic moments. Now another thing I want to mention is how the story is structured and how certain information is revealed. The way that certain information is revealed in this movie does leave a lot up to plot holes. It's not a huge deal throughout this movie, but it is something I noticed and I thought I should mention it. Now there are a few scenes in this movie that do feel forced with its emotions that it's trying to convey. It did take me out of it for those parts of the scene, but it didn't really ruin the movie or anything, and it's over fairly quickly. The pacing of this film is great. It's only an hour and 44 minutes and it never feels like it wastes any time, and it's always engaging and moving along at a quick pace. The way that the opening sequence is filmed and edited gives a lot of information about the two main characters and their personality. It's a really great way to get the exposition out of the way and get into the main meat of the film. Now overall this movie was pretty fun and I definitely enjoyed myself, and I'll probably rewatch it at some point. It felt like a step up from D&D in many ways, and this one gets a very strong 6 out of 10. And I also got around to watching Nobody. Now I enjoyed this movie quite a lot and certainly was a lot of fun. The movie stars Bob Odenkirk and he's a genuinely great choice for this type of role. Now this movie's story certainly feels very familiar, especially considering the fact that this is from the same writer as John Wick. And there are many aspects such as the villains and story progression throughout this story that feel very similar to John Wick. But this movie really manages to have its own sense of personality and style to the point where it doesn't feel like a ripoff of John Wick. I really enjoyed the entire tone of this movie. It feels very self-aware and knows exactly what it wants to be, and I laughed at several points throughout this film. The pacing of this movie is also very well done. The pacing at the beginning of the film is kind of slower compared to the rest of it, but it really helps build up this character and the tension throughout the film. And at a certain point in the story, the film just keeps going on and doesn't slow down at all. The editing and song choices in this movie were also very well done and gave off a very self-aware tone to the movie. The song choices in this movie for the most part were pretty good and very well done, but they weren't perfect throughout every single song choice throughout this entire movie. But those are small complaints and it was nothing really major that ruined anything. Now the action fight scenes in this movie were absolutely incredible and were not short on being creative and inventive with its concept for martial arts. Another aspect that I really appreciated about the action scenes in this movie is that there's a certain level of authenticity to them. The main character gets injured and hurt at certain points and is still able to defeat his enemies. I really appreciate that detail since so many movies present their main characters as invincible superheroes that never get hurt. It brings a certain sense of raw authenticity to this movie. The movie is also able to strike an absolutely perfect balance between the comedic personality of the nature of this movie to a very well done character-driven drama throughout certain points of it. The action sequences throughout this film also managed to maintain a very self-aware tone throughout it all. Now this movie is only an hour and a half long and it really helps with the pacing so it just flies right by after a certain point. Now overall this movie was a lot of fun and entertaining and I'll definitely watch it again, so this one gets a very strong 7 out of 10.